I mean, when I think of chunking, I think of plop, plop. I'm guessing you've already heard about the chunking technique, and if you're anything like me, you found it pretty boring. I mean, yawn, snore, snore. How is breaking things down into smaller parts supposed to help your memory? And isn't that just adding more work? Well, yes, no, maybe so. And if you understand chunking in its multiple dimensions, you will probably find that it's a little bit more exciting than it seems, even if the word is... So David Sousa, he really gives the core of what chunking is in his book, How the Brain Learns. If you haven't read it, it's quite good. And I'm going to change his example, but it's the core idea is that if you look at the word chunking, you're seeing an example of chunking.
What that means, according to the theory of chunking, is that the brain isn't spelling this word out. Rather, something in the brain is causing us to perceive it as an individual unit.
In the same way that your brain doesn't necessarily see two things here, it sees a pair. And here, it doesn't necessarily say one thing here. It just sees a thing. And then if we put it here together, it's not necessarily your brain is somehow going, okay, so there are three things now, and that could mean a triplet or a trio or any other variation of those things. It has chunked them together, and your brain might, under certain conditions, actually see these three things as one object if the lighting suggested that they were one object to your brain. Even if your brain did perceive individual pieces, it might show it to you as one piece. That's chunking.
However, what's cool there for those of us using memory techniques is that we can actually unchunk it to see that the word king is in here and that the word Hun is in here. And then if we had to memorize a word like chunking, we could make a mnemonic image that has Attila the Hun crowning himself as king. And what is his crown? His crown is actually the letter C itself. So we use three individual chunks in order to create another image, and this is very, very useful for memorizing, for example, foreign language vocabulary, and then even entire sentences in other languages or formulas and so forth.
So where did this term chunking come from in the first place? As far as I can tell, it's 1956. Dr. George Miller is doing some research on how telephone numbers are put together.
And he writes a paper called The Magical Number 7 Plus or Minus 2.
And he's just noticing how the brain has this capacity to deal with, in short-term memory or working memory, a set of digits. And this has to do with the history of the telephone, where in the early days of the phone, you might have three numbers. But as more and more people got phones, they needed to make the numbers longer and longer and longer. So then you started to have a country code and an area code and then a neighborhood code and then finally your code, which would be the final four digits of the number, or however your region worked all of that stuff out. And he just said, isn't it curious that the brain can deal with 7 digits plus or minus 2 with great ease, but if it's any more than that, it starts to get really bogged down and challenged. Now, from our perspective as people using memory techniques, what's fascinating is how we've been able to chunk in order to break that limit. There are people like Marno Herman, who was on the podcast. He's been in the Magnetic Memory Method Masterclass. He memorized 1,200 digits of pi. He can recite them all in 2 different languages, and that's because he's used techniques to chunk those numbers in particular ways. And if you listen to that episode of the podcast with Marno Herman, he talks about how he tried to do it without any sort of memory technique before, and then he learned the Magnetic Memory Method, and then he did it again, and then, wow, everything works very, very well, very, very quickly, and he's able to recite it very crisply. And he even broke a record, I believe, in his country, South Africa, and wow, he was like #1 at that year's competition. And no doubt, because he did it in 2 languages.
So how does this work for memorizing numbers, to chunk numbers down when they're not going to be just a phone number like 3724195, but it's going to be 1,200 digits? Well, we need to use something called the major system that allows us to chunk numbers into pairs so that those numbers all have images, which can then be arranged in what you might call multisensory pictures, and those are arranged into memory palaces. To give an example of the major in action, let's use an example of memorizing George Miller having written the magical number 7 plus or minus 2 in 1956. So we would take an image based on the major 19, Tipper Gore is what I typically use, and she would be having Miller time while she's whipping a leash made out of licorice.
And this just makes things chunked together, and they are chunked yet again in a memory palace because now you've associated the location of that information with a space that you remember. So you can imagine all of this happening around 1956 right here, and the whole thing, a Miller can of beer, it is now chunked together. It is linked to that space as a single unit. Remember, now the brain is not necessarily seeing them as separate entities, but it has brought them together almost as if they were one, but then they can be taken apart again. That is chunking and unchunking, or what you could call encoding and decoding.
But wait, magnetic friends, there's more. We can also chunk with acronyms.
One of my favorite examples for chunking and acronyms is YOLO, because YOLO is a chunk of a chunk, so to speak. You only live once is already a chunk. It's a chunk of a chunk of a chunk. Because if we take that idea that U is a chunk of YOU to make U, then we have you only live once, which is a next chunk, and then YOLO chunks it again. So it's a chunk of a chunk of a chunk. But yeah, you only live once is basically a set of words that are themselves chunked together by the brain, and then YOLO, you look at that and you can figure it out. You only live once. So work with acronyms. When I give speeches, I don't always memorize them word for word. My TEDx, yes, verbatim, word for word memorization. That's the way you want a speech to be. But when I give more private talks at local business meetings, and there's going to be 50, 60 people there, or whatever the case might be, sometimes half that amount, sometimes a little bit more, I don't sit there and memorize the speech word for word. What I often do is chunk it together with an acronym. So for example, I often teach the free formula when it comes to various things. I actually use the free formula in different ways. So if I'm talking about doing a business online, I'll talk about it in a particular way. If I'm talking to you as memory students, I'll talk about being able to have frequent practice in a state of relaxation and a spirit of experimentation, and in a way that keeps you endlessly engaged and entertained. FREE. And I can just mentally walk through each of those parts, what it means to practice frequently, and there are certain subpoints to that which use another separate acronym. I highly recommend that you do this too, and whenever you're doing exams and studying for things like that, see if you can't work that out. Likewise, in language learning, you can sometimes find little things in words that will help you. So a word in German like Obst is for fruit, and maybe you know a software like OBS, you can try and fit that in there. Link them together. Chunk acronyms you know together. And there's not going to be necessarily that many opportunities, but if you look for them, you can maximize them. Acronyms are powerful. Now, what about mind maps? Are they chunking? Well, yes and no. And in a way, I use them to chunk all kinds of things all the time. So for example, I invited you to the Memory Detective game, which you can get advanced notification for at magneticmemorymethod.com/NS. And a lot of that was mind mapped out beforehand. And so using a mind map, I chunked out what you would call the hero's journey. What is the ghost that the hero is going to suffer from his past? And then what is the world going to look like? What's the dynamic tension that is yanking him around and causing him to have all kinds of issues? And then I think, what is going to be the dilemma that forces him to make a decision in action? And then who are going to be the allies that help him and all that sort of stuff. Why are these chunks? Well, because they are being put together in the form of a larger narrative. They are individual pieces that come to seem like a seamless whole. And that is made as strong as possible by figuring out as much in advance as possible, by breaking it down in a holistic way that allows it to return to something that feels very holistic and ultimately leads to a story and a story world in which we can play a game. So in this sense, I would say mind mapping is excellent for chunking. And you can chunk together different ideas that you want to memorize in a similar way, especially when sequences are involved, relationships are involved between the different pieces of information. Then there are things like memory palaces and flashcards and how you can chunk those together. If you were to make a little drawing of your memory palace and then place the information that you're having on a station by station basis on a flashcard, you can then chunk those flashcards together in particular ways. Now, you can have the images be individual units that chunk together to help you recall a piece of information, but then you can also think of strategic ways to organize those pieces within the memory palace in order to create certain outcomes. So, for example, you could chunk a bunch of words together related to career and have them go in an individual memory palace. Or you could chunk a bunch of words together that make a phrase that you've always wanted to learn and put those in a memory palace. And I'm sure you can think of different ways to arrange your cards within memory palaces, but just know that you can chunk using cards and have wonderful outcomes that help you learn faster and remember more. And chunking is really what I'm after in this new game and this novel, helping you chunk yourself together with a hero as he takes on learning the great memory tradition and integrating it, weaving it into his day. And then we're going to play a game to see if we can do this in real time in a way that allows people to learn together, that is exciting, and no one feels excluded because of the way that I designed the game. We're going to chunk ourselves together into a wild memory land, and it's just going to happen to be a kind of memory land that has a little bit of darkness. Not the Lovecraftian no to the universe darkness, but the Nietzschean say yes and show up and make it happen. So if you want to chunk together, make sure to go to magneticmemorymethod.com/NS to get first notification when the tickets go live for the game and have access to this new book. I hope you'll enjoy it. There's a sample there for you. Thanks as always for watching the Magnetic Memory Method channel. And until we have a chance to speak again, keep yourself magnetic. And if you like memory science videos like these, you might want to watch a very, very important video with something related to this that we didn't raise today, but you're definitely going to want to know these rules if you use things like index card chunking. And that video is all about active recall. So go ahead, stick around, and watch that next. It'll appear on the screen or with a link down below. Thank you again. And until we have a chance to speak again, keep yourself magnetic. Plop, plop.